are now going to begin. My name is Bria Smith. I am a 17-year-old junior at Franklin High School, also working with a nonprofit at LIT, and it's helping us with being active in the community and talking to political leaders.
My name is Brikea Hines. I am a 16-year-old sophomore at Franklin High School, and I also work for the organization LIT.
So you will get your 30 to 45 seconds to introduce yourself and you as a candidate, and you will have to speak into the mic because we are live streaming it right now.
Okay. Fantastic. Hello, everyone. My name is Phil Anderson. I'm the Libertarian candidate for governor. This is Patrick Baird, my running mate. He's running for lieutenant governor. Raise your hand if you know what libertarianism is. Let me give you a brief description. Basically, it means that people have the right to live their lives as they choose, as long as they don't interfere with other people's right to do the same thing. So we want to free the world in our lifetime. And free for what? People should be free to live their lives as they choose, to make decisions about who they marry, where their kids go to school, what they ingest, have all every choice that they should have. And government, insofar as it should be involved, should be at the lowest level possible. So we want to return state and federal government to the most local level possible. Any decision that can be made that involves government should be done at the county level, the neighborhood level, the city level, the school district level, or the personal level, as long as it doesn't bother, as long as you're not affecting somebody else in making those decisions. That's our general principle, and I think my 45 seconds is up. Do we got to give them the mic when it's time for them? Okay. Okay. Well, I'll pass it right now then. Does anyone have a question?
I will admit that I am not the most knowledgeable person when it comes to libertarian issues, but now I've got a question about how do you deal with the public education system then?
Oh, sorry. Okay. We think people should have more choices in terms of where they send their kids to school, and they should be empowered to have the resources to do that. So right now, one of the things that's ignored in our state is that property taxes generally fund schools, but homeowners pay property taxes, but also renters do as well. So when the state does its calculations in terms of open enrollment, there's a number attached to every student in a district. That's the cost or the tuition level or whatever it might be. If you rent, you should have access to those funds that you've already, in essence, paid in taxes. It's been equalized to a certain extent, but you paid that in taxes through rent to choose the schools that you want. There should still be some public schools because we don't want to have anyone that doesn't have access to education. And if people decide to support the public schools, that's fantastic. But in a lot of situations, including here in Milwaukee, people are largely dissatisfied with their school system. They want to support it because it seems like they don't have any other choice. But we prefer to have situations where people can open schools, teachers can start schools, schools that are appropriate to whatever sort of education that you want your children to have.
For you, and talking about the education system, would you be in support of reinstalling the Chapter 220 program or forcing children to go into their zone schooling and kind of having their academics with that? Or if you know what the Chapter 220 program is? No, so it's just a quick overview. It's just getting inner city students to diversify suburban areas. So you have transportation. Milwaukee Public School District will pay for transportation to take inner city students to suburban areas to diversify the schooling so they can get better education. Because I know zone schooling, where students are forced to go to schools that are in their neighborhoods that aren't up to par with their potential education.
So my answer is, I think it goes back to my point I made about choice, and that if your tax dollars and the rent you're paying is funding the school system, even those schools that are in the system, you should be allowed to attend, and there should be some healthy competition. Because in some cases, schools are located in places now that may have been advantageous 20 or 30 years ago but aren't anymore. Or the demographics, not necessarily like the racial or economic demographics, but the neighborhood might have changed where there's more industrial stuff going on around there, or the transportation system has changed. And I think the school systems need to be responsive to that. And if people are going to public schools but want to choose a different one for whatever reason, they should be allowed to do so.
All right, I have a question for you. How does a libertarian like yourself help oppressed communities facing structural discrimination and disadvantages in helping to uplift them in the community?
So if I heard... Well, the government, its basic and best function is defending people against being discriminated against and defending their rights, their basic human rights to life and liberty, and pursuing what they want to pursue. Clearly, as you alluded to, there are situations, and one of our big one of our big issues in this election is criminal justice reform, and that's one area where there is structural discrimination, specifically about marijuana laws and the ways that people are incarcerated. That's something where the government has not only have a task, but a responsibility to stand up for people's rights and to help that sort of thing in whatever case it might be. I think that's a proper role of government that our founders envisioned. To a certain extent, that's as far as it should go. I mean, there's still a role for government to try to correct some wrongs and try to restore things to a more equitable in terms of people's access to employment, occupational licensing, access to capital, those sorts of things that will enable people to have a fair playing field in terms of opportunity. So I think there's definitely a role for government there in fighting that structural, especially since it's a lot of government intervention that started the structural inequities to begin with. It's time to roll that back.
I'm looking at this, piece of literature you have here. It said you'll immediately convene a pardon advisory board. How is that different than what's going on now?
Let me tell you, boy. So Governor Walker has not, that's like a softball question. I love that. So if you don't mind, though, I'd like to do what's on the back of that, I think, is our 6-point plan. All of those things, they don't need to be done in that order. But currently, the governor has no interest in pardoning anybody, obviously. He wants to jail people. He's a big fan of building more jails and jailing more people. I think the jail builders and the people that run the jails are campaign donors of his, maybe. But that's just one part of our 6 things that we want to accomplish in criminal justice reform, starting with legalizing marijuana, because we know that the war on drugs is racist. Now we know that its intent was racist. We always knew that the results were racist. And it's just a travesty. So we can end that pretty quickly because there's a lot of public support for that. But also ending mandatory minimum sentencing, allowing judges to do the right thing in a courtroom. If they see a law that's unjust or a situation that's unjust, they don't have to sentence somebody to a certain minimum number of years. Moving on to jury nullification, which that's not a widely known issue, but jury nullification is a real constitutional right. The juries can find somebody not guilty, not because they didn't actually do whatever they were accused of, but because the law was unjust. So that's something that should be allowed to happen. And right now in Wisconsin courtrooms, it's not by a Supreme Court procedural rule. Now moving on to the pardoning authority, which you mentioned, I would convene that right away and start letting people out of jail who are guilty of minor drug crimes or what have you that are non-violent crimes. Next would be, or along with that, expungement of records. I've been coordinating with Clean Slate Wisconsin to look at expungement of records so that people that have been unjustly convicted aren't bearing the burden of that conviction on their record for the rest of their lives. And last of all, in terms of the punishment fitting the crime, restricting felons' right to vote, not only when they're out and on paper, but even when they're in prison, or anybody who's in prison, their right to vote, unless they're guilty of voting fraud or some other identity fraud, they should be allowed to vote even when they're in jail, because the punishment of not being able to vote does not fit the crime of being incarcerated in most cases.
Okay, guess what time it is? 2-minute warning.
2-minute warning.
It's your 2-minute warning. You should be guiding your conversation to the end. You should be asking your last questions and your voter.
Okay, so this is a question I always ask third-party candidates. Why is a vote for you not a wasted vote?
My instinct is to just answer. Because even if we don't win, we get enough votes, we move the needle in the right direction. Right now, there are a lot of people that agree with us, and this is my 3rd campaign. I ran for state assembly in 2014 and U.S. Senate in 2016. There are a ton of people that agree with us on a lot of issues, in particular, the monopoly, in essence, of the two-party system. But if we, especially on the issues that we agree with, if you agree with me on these things, especially criminal justice, which we can start enacting right away, and you vote Libertarian or threaten to vote Libertarian, or when Marquette calls you and asks you who you're going to vote for, you say, I'm voting for the Libertarian, we can make the Republicans and Democrats take notice, and even if we don't win, we can get the policies in place. And we've seen that happen in a variety of races. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Any few last words you want to add?
Oh, I think I'm out of time. But please consider us as an alternative. We mean what we say. We're against the two-party system. We're free of corruption because we're not about collecting power. We're about returning it back to people. And that's what we really stand for, is people as individuals.